Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining V2 for our webinar all about cybersecurity and RSA. My name is Caitlin Holbrook. I'm EVP and Managing Director. I oversee our B2B technology practice, where I'm very fortunate to be in the throes with a lot of our cybersecurity clients. I'm thrilled to have a few folks from our client roster and their investors and the media that we work with here with us today. Before we dive into what I hope will be a really helpful and productive conversation, let me introduce our panelists. We have Murad Yasayan, who's Managing Director of Paladin Capital Group, and he oversees the firm's cyber fund. We have Michael Parisi, who's Head of Client Acquisition at Shellman, also a V2 client. And last but not least, we have Sam Sabin, who many of you probably know as cybersecurity reporter at Axios. Thank you all for being here. So we're T-minus less than a month, probably just a few weeks until RSA, the event for cybersecurity each and every year. I think it gets bigger by folds, it seems like. It's a crazy show. It does tend to, at least in our experience, set the tone for the rest of the year, right? It's happening a little later this year, I think, than normal, but what we see at the show and coming out of the show will be what a lot of brands and I think CISOs and other folks in the sector focus on well after. AI was the big topic last year. We want to start with kind of your perspectives on what you think might be the big trends, some of the conversations, what you're thinking about, you paying attention to at the show. Murad, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks for having me for this. Yeah, a few things that I think we're paying attention to. I think AI will still obviously be very prominent in conversations. I hope, though, that we start to see a little bit more clarity about what exactly we mean when we're saying AI, because to me, it's really three different buckets. It's how are we using AI to make cybersecurity more effective, better detection, better prevention. There's obviously a lot of that's been happening for a while and is now hopefully continuing. But also AI is being used by adversaries, and what does that mean for new types of threats and maybe the things that we need to do to be prepared for that, and the approaches that we've had in the past that haven't worked for that. And then, of course, AI itself is a new risk surface, right? So I think that's coming more into the consciousness of CISOs of, this is another part of my digital infrastructure, kind of like cloud, that my old security things that import to cloud. And so same how my existing security things may not port over to AI. And so I think that'll be a big conversation. But I think also what is going to be important is to recognize that obviously for good reason, there's a lot of focus from folks like me and at RSA about innovation and startups and all the new things that are happening. But a lot of the old problems are still the current problems, right? It's not like we've sort of solved per se, some of the existing challenges. Ransomware is still running rampant. And I think, so we're looking for what companies are prioritizing and doing, and how new startups are addressing kind of existing threats, which are not going away and only increasing. So those are some of the things that that we'll be looking out for.
That's great. Michael, I know when we spoke a few days ago, you had some thoughts on AI. Do you want to start there and then anything else that might be top of mind?
Yeah, sure. I agree with what Murad said. I think AI is obviously going to continue to be a topic. However, I think there's going to be more focus on what is everyone's role within quote unquote AI, right? There's been a lot of confusion from organizations that are looking to adopt it, right? So if we're going to bring it in-house and we're going to use it, whether it's for cybersecurity or for other functions, what does that mean in order to adopt AI? If I'm a vendor that's providing AI-enabled solutions, what types of assurances do I need to provide? Not just around bias associated with the models, but are there validated assurances? So from my perspective, and what we've seen as a cybersecurity attestation firm, right, an assessment firm, is those vendors that are looking to provide AI-enabled solutions, or even if they're embedded right within the solutions that are there today, how can they provide a level of trust relative to those solutions and those capabilities? And we're seeing that manifest itself in the form of new frameworks, compliance standards and requirements like ISO 42001. Obviously, a lot of stuff that's going on in the EU. NIST has an RMF out there for artificial intelligence. So I think we'll see a lot of conversation around how do we obtain independent validated assurances over AI solutions. In addition to that, it's interesting, healthcare hasn't necessarily been a spotlight at RSA in the past. Some organizations talk about it as a relevant industry, but I do think you'll see a lot more conversation around healthcare from an industry perspective, more specifically at RSA this year. Not only with some of the recent events that have happened and everyone is familiar with relative to Change Healthcare and United, but also there's been an increased focus on healthcare from a critical infrastructure perspective across the country. We've seen a number of different states start to introduce state-specific regulations around protecting hospital systems and patient data. So I do anticipate that that's going to be a hot topic at RSA this year. Really, two other things quickly. I like to refer to it as the fog of more. So there's so many different security vendors out there, many of which are vaporware, frankly. And if you're a CISO or a CIO, how do you wade through that fog of all these different vendors and all these solutions and boil it down to what really makes the most sense from a capability perspective? That's always a challenge, and I think that will continue to be a challenge at RSA this year. If you go to that show without a plan, you're just going to end up swimming in the deep end, right? So we are seeing a lot of our clients push back on a number of cybersecurity vendors to say, what are you actually doing as part of my stack, right? And how do I boil it down to best of breed? And then lastly, it's still out there, zero trust. That was, of course, the hot topic, a couple of years ago. I think AI has eclipsed that a little bit, but let's not take our eye off the ball. In recent conversations, even with Department of Homeland Security that I had a couple of weeks ago, it's coming, and it's going to be a requirement for all agencies. And I think some organizations have kind of forgotten about that. And I think you're going to see that come back up in conversations at the show this year.
Yeah, that's great. I think the thing that stuck with me in all that you said, at least for our audience, which is communicators, is that fog of more. And I think, our job, at least whether we're in-house or agency comms partners, is not just how do you make that stand out for your customers, but how do you, dispel that fog for folks in the media analyst community. So Sam, maybe whether it's the fog of more or kind of cutting through that clutter, what are some of the trends that maybe you're going to be following and perhaps maybe trying to cut through the clutter around?
Yeah, I was just trying to list out everything that I'm watching, and it's way too much for the time that we have here. But in terms of cutting through the clutter, I think this is going to echo what Murad was saying. AI obviously is going to be a hot issue. It is going to be the thing that I'm going to probably bring up in every conversation that I have with folks out there. But I'm more interested less in how is this going to help cybersecurity. I feel like I hear a lot about co-pilots. I feel like I hear a lot about how this is going to help with the workforce. Those are all great, but it also feels like we're just scratching at the surface of AI. And I'm more curious about how deep this well is, right? I guess to quote Casey Musgraves. And so I'm interested to see where this conversation is progressing, less of a hot button, oh, we're also doing AI enabled stuff. AI has been around for years. It didn't just show up when ChatGPT showed up, right? That is kind of where I'm trying to cut through the fog. And I feel like the other trends that I'm seeing really are just a continuation of all the trends that we're seeing in cybersecurity. RSA is just like a great gathering point to talk about all of them. We're going to hear a lot about critical infrastructure, whether it's healthcare, water, etc. It's an issue that is big every year, especially for government officials who are going to RSA, who are doing keynotes, who are going to be at various sideline events. And I also think the threat landscape is huge, right? Ransomware has been touched on, that is always a topic. But I also think China specifically will probably be a hot issue. I will probably be in many a panel where Bolt Typhoon is mentioned, and I'm curious always, of course, to hear more about what we don't know, what's misunderstood about those threat actors, what's missing in media coverage around that, and things like that. And of course, an undercurrent in all of that is the elections, but this year is a little weird. I don't know if it's just like too soon to talk about elections. It feels like it's always going to be a hot button issue, but then every conference I go to, it's barely mentioned, or it's just like oh yeah, elections. So I don't know if we're all just dragging our feet until no, until like summertime to talk about it
Yeah.
more. But yeah, that's also something I'll be watching out for as well.
Michael, Murad, I'd be curious on your perspectives on the elections in particular, because we kind of hear it bubbling, but it feels like no one's kind of jumped into the deep end. Is that something you're hearing from clients and portfolio companies and brands that you're working with?
Not, I mean, it seems like we should be more so. I think there's maybe perhaps a bit of denial that it's only 6 months or 7 months
Yes.
away. You know, I think certainly as we've seen in prior ones, you know, cyber plays a really important role, and I think that the vulnerabilities to it are even more so now, right? Especially in kind of the AI era of, you know, deep fakes and things like that. So I think it's going to be really interesting. There isn't, I think, enough you know, conversation about that, and I really worry that there isn't enough attention and spend on that from campaigns and other institutions and agencies that should be worried about these things, and are often trying to fund these things on a very you know, relatively small budgets when we're then up against like the GDP of other nation states.
Yeah.
So it does make me worry a lot.
Yeah, I would add, I would echo a lot of those comments. A lot of our clients aren't necessarily focused on it, or I think they're distracted by other things, or
Yeah.
to Laura's point, they don't want to admit that it's coming. But the comments that we are getting from a cybersecurity attestation, regulation, compliance perspective, relative to the election, is you know, the time frame around enforcement for some of the standards that are out there, right? So, for example, we're very big in the CMMC space relative to DoD. And as we know, that's been swirling for years, right? And we're always asking the question, is this year gonna be the year for CMMC? And it does, from what we're seeing, it does feel as if a number of organizations think it will be. And as a result, you know, we're doing a lot of readiness assessments to help organizations assess where they are relative to where they need to be. But the hanging question for all of our clients is, depending upon the administration, is it actually going to be enforced? Is 2025 actually when the requirement is going to come out? What's going to be the stipulation for the different levels and expectation around having assessments validated from a cybersecurity perspective as opposed to just a self-attestation? So a lot of our clients are tying that back to the election, the administration. They know that it's coming and it's going to move forward, but it could move quicker or it could be a heavier hammer depending upon the outcome of the election and administration.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing.
We'll have to have another webinar after the election because we could probably talk for 2 hours then. But back to RSA, I'm sure your inboxes are already flooded with invites to meetings and parties and other things happening. Sam, I know you've heard from folks on the V2 team already, but would love to, and maybe we start with you, Sam, like what will get your attention? We talked about some of the topics, we talked about some of the stuff that you're maybe don't want to, you know, won't get your attention or won't stand out, but any insight into what may, is it a type of source? Is it a certain topic? Is it, you know, time of day, or are you just drinking from the fire hose right now?
I am really drinking from the fire hose. It's quite bad. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. I personally haven't even started scheduling one-on-one meetings, like waiting for other things to fall into the schedule. So it's a mess in that inbox of mine. But I would say the topics earlier, right? If you have anyone who can cut through AI noise, threat intel noise, for our audience, it is very national. I don't I like product launches are very cool and I know take a lot of effort, but for my audience, it's so general that a product launch probably isn't going to be the thing that gets me. But if you can speak to a larger trend, you can make it something that really matters for a general audience that maybe some people know a little bit about cybersecurity who read our newsletter, but some people are also emailing me asking like what the dark web is, right? Like it
Mm.
really is an audience that I think runs the gamut. And so if you can concisely tell me like why an Axios audience would care about this, that's going to go a long way. And if I have not replied, I am flagging every email. I will reply. I promise. It's going to happen. But that's typically that, and also just being so mindful of the fact that I have like every PR person imaginable, probably and more in my inbox, texting me. I've had people calling me, signal messaging me. Just send me an email with like a list of who's going, when the event is, or when they're free, and that will make everything so much easier, and I'll be more likely to open it and read it
Good
that way.
old-fashioned email. I'm here for
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Murad, how about you? Are you taking meetings, walking the floor, doing a little bit of both? What does your schedule look like? And for folks that might want to connect with you, like what's the way to your calendar?
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of everything. Certainly, we want to walk the floor. I mean, obviously, nearly all of our portfolio companies as a cyber-focused investor are there, so we certainly want to spend time with them and kind of check out what's new. I have the luxury, I guess, that Sam doesn't, is that there's lots of me. Our most of our firm will show up there, and so if not me, somebody from the team can probably take a meeting. I mean, we're in the business of meeting entrepreneurs and companies, and so the bar for us to take a conversation is pretty low. Honestly, like we take 600 meetings a year, so lots of them happen at RSA and other conferences like that. So that's not so much, I think, the challenge with us. I think always it helps for us to really, when someone reaches out, to just understand, just clarity and kind of, Michael was saying this earlier, like what are you actually focused on? What are the outcomes that your company's solution is proposing to do, and just demonstrating credibility, because ultimately it's all of us are kind of in a people business, and we're betting on people when we invest in companies, and a huge part of that is understanding who they are and their creds, and really getting excited about that. But yeah, the bar for taking the meeting will be low, but in terms of those are the things, I guess, that would stand out to me in terms of being excited about the conversation.
Yeah, so it sounds like from at least the comms perspective, it's really about making that story clear about what the company does and then who are the people behind the
Yeah.
company. Great. Michael, anything you'd add or anything different from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. I mean, the mix of visiting with current clients, wanting to understand what are some of the new solutions that are out there in the marketplace. Being an attestation firm, we don't provide consulting and advisory by design, but all of our clients ask us, right? What are you seeing out there? Are there organizations that you're partnered with that we can talk to help us? Especially when it comes to a lot of deficiencies that we may find through our assessments in their environment. I do have a lot of media interviews. I always have good intentions of walking the floor. That usually never happens because there's so many different meetings and conversations that are happening outside the floor at the surrounding hotels. And so, good intentions. Sometimes I get a little bit in on the floor, but not too far. And then we're actually doing a number of workshops, something a little bit different this year, where we're getting folks together, not the traditional happy hour networking events. Of course, we're going to be going to a bunch of those, but we'll get a small group of folks together to say, hey, let us take you through the new ISO 42001 standard around AI, right? Let us help you navigate it. What does it mean? What is important? How do you adopt it and implement it? So we've got 3 or 4 workshops that we're holding at RSA, more like meetups, if you will, to have a conversation around these things. And we'll have some media folks that will be attending that as well, and kind of giving a readout of, hey, here's a workshop or a conversation that was interesting at RSA on this topic.
Yeah. Michael, question for you about that. With attention so spread out at the show and, meetings changing all the time, how do you get butts in seats at something like that? Is it just finding the right folks that really care about the topic? Is there some kind of draw? Like, what's the secret for other brands to think about and getting traffic to those types of sessions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for us, it's working the network, right? So as you have folks within your network, as Sam indicated, there's only so much time, and there's only so many folks that you're really going to take a meeting with. What are you going to get out of it? Is there something of value you're going to get out of it? So certainly working our network, preparation. I mean, I've been having conversations back in November and December with organizations saying, let's do something at RSA. So, 6 months of building up to it. And then also, depending upon who the other stakeholders are that are going to be there, right? So, if you have a key client or an organization that's viewed as a thought leader in this space, one of our largest partners is Zscaler, for example. So the fact that I have folks from Zscaler going to a workshop, when you tell others, they're like, well, I want to be there because they're obviously a thought leader within this space. I want to hear what they're saying, right, and what they're working on. So I think those are some of the factors to try and secure folks, and also networking opportunities. I mean, people want to be with people again, or at least some people want to be, right? So they don't want it to be all about business and solution and demos, and they want to get to know people, and what are they doing, either personally or professionally.
Yeah.
So really creating an environment for that networking is important.
I think that's so true. We heard from an influencer recently that they get their best intel at RSA at the after parties when they are just kind of like, rubbing elbows with folks and having a drink or whatever it may be. Would welcome any perspectives on that. Like, are you out, Sam, after hours kind of getting scoops beyond the show floor and in your formal meetings? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, it really is a stacked day, easily 12 hours every day at RSA. I've had to start telling people you cannot trust that I will show up to a breakfast event unless, I'm scheduled to be there. I have one breakfast panel I will definitely be at moderating this year. But it really is just, for me, I'm barely at the panels nowadays, unless they're major big gets at keynotes, because all of the most useful information usually comes from these one-on-one meetings. They come from vendor parties that I'm allowed to go to. Some of them I'm not, which is kind of rude. Frankly, I understand why, but or it's at receptions. I mean, even Axios has started doing its own receptions and happy hours and stuff like that, just for that sole purpose, because that really is like the bread and butter of RSA. I mean, the problems remain the same, but I don't. So sometimes the content can be kind of repetitive if you've been in the space for a long time, but the conversations, the gathering points, that is like why I keep going every year to RSA. Yeah.
Murat, anything that folks should know or that you think about as it relates to the after parties, the kind of fun side of RSA? Not that it's not all fun.
Sure, exactly. No, I think those events are great. And I think, a lot of our portfolio companies are basically vendors, right? So I would say that when those events are really well done, I think it's really an opportunity for those companies to kind of, it's a representation of yourself, right? So you're kind of showcasing like your culture and what kind of company are you? And so to the extent you have customers and prospects coming to that, or even maybe prospective employees coming to that, it's a really great way for a company to sort of show why they're a great company to partner with, maybe why they're a great place to work. So we've seen companies that do a good job of that, like really get a lot of value. And so I think, putting some effort into it beyond just being the generic, come for free drinks and food, I think goes, a long way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I will be at bouncing between several, and of course we have our own cocktail event as well. So not to be outdone.
Yeah. No, well, I think you bring up a good point about employer brand. So much of RSA, I think, is focused on kind of the external influencers, the sales pipeline, to maybe a lesser extent, partners, but there is so much talent swirling in the show that it is a great opportunity to build a brand for your potential employees. So I think you raise a good point there. Let's shift gears slightly to after RSA. I think we've already talked about some of the trends that may come out post-event, the election being a big one, zero trust. Are there any that we haven't touched on, or things that you think will come into the spotlight, come Q3 into Q4?
One area that I would add that we're actually thinking a lot about, just as a trend, or thinking about companies that might be playing in this space, is that I think that there's going to be a need for companies to figure out how they can recover more quickly. And so I think that we all know that cybersecurity is a risk management exercise. Effectively, like, we're never going to be 100% full fail safe that we're secure. And there are inevitably going to be compromises and breaches, whether that's your vanilla data breach or ransomware. So I think being able to be resilient to that and recover from that is still a very human intensive, services intensive aspect, which obviously won't go away. So, but if there are technologies that can speed that up or make that easier, that's a big thing that we're focused on in terms of seeing where there might be opportunities for that.
Great.
Yeah, just to chime in there, I love that. I completely agree. There's obviously going to be a lot of conversations around the defense and the proactive defense. But I agree with Laurent. I think there's going to be more conversations later in the year of, look, we're not going to be able to stop everything. So what happens if it happens to you? If you have a bad day, right? Can you actually recover, and how quickly can you resume operations? Again, I'll bring it back to the Change Healthcare example. They're still not recovered, right? And there's a number of issues associated with that. So I agree. I think there's going to be a focus even after the show to say, if or when it does happen, right? What do we need to do from an operational perspective? I think the other thing that's interesting, and we can have a whole different conversation about this, but we are seeing a lot of chatter from a number of our clients about, how much dependency they have on the cloud. If you remember, for a number of years, it was all about, well, when is everyone going to move to the cloud? Or organizations are saying, well, we're not in the cloud. We don't want to do that. No, everybody is, whether you realize it or not, whether you like it or not. But when you look at some of the things that happened, again, from Change Healthcare, from United, there was a high dependency on the cloud that kind of bit a number of hospital systems. And so we're seeing a number of hospital systems saying, you know what, we're going back to on-prem from a risk perspective, and we can recover quicker if we're going on-prem as well. That's going to be interesting to see what that dynamic does, right, later in the year. And then lastly, nobody's quite talking about it yet, but I think not only will you see consolidation, of course, right, of cybersecurity companies and vendors. I think we'll see a lot of that toward the end of this year. But also, I think you're going to start to see a merge of information security and IT operations. Because when you look at the speed at which traditional IT operations is able to address, say, a P1 or a severe issue, we're talking about being down for minutes, right? When maybe hours. That the average time to detect a cybersecurity issue is over 200 days. Right? So what is it that IT ops is able to do to detect an issue and address it that information security is not doing? So we're seeing a lot of organizations say, is there a way that we can take information security, cybersecurity, and apply the IT ops model so that we can detect these issues quicker, address them quicker, recover quicker? So that convergence will be something interesting that I think you'll hear more about toward the end of the year.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And from a comms perspective, it's interesting because the longer those things go, and I think the less of a plan that's in place, obviously, the more complicated the communication around it becomes. Interesting work to be in, but projects you never want to have to be involved in. I think we have 1 or 2 more minutes, I guess, just for attendees. If you have any questions for anyone specifically on the panel or generally, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or chat and we'll address them. But before we go there, wanted to pose to you, Sam, you mentioned press releases, not press releases, product news, not necessarily a great motivator for coverage. Any thoughts on press releases and kind of when people put them out, if they go before the show, if they go during the show? This is, as you might imagine, a very hot topic in the crowd that I run in. Would just love to hear your perspective on it.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I feel like I'm of 2 schools of thought, which are not going to be helpful. The first is either releasing during the show is a bit mayhem, right? I'm not really checking my inbox nearly as much as maybe I am the week before and the week after. So I feel like if you're going to announce it, you want to get the press release out there before the show. Or during the show so you can talk about it. I would do it like a week or 2 before if you're able. I'd say that I think we're only like 2 weeks out, so crunch time.
Yeah.
The other thought I have is I'm also more likely to be clued into it if you tell me ahead of time, right? So a lot of these press releases will have embargoes ahead of time. So if you're even able to like give me a heads up, like, hey, we're going to be unveiling this on Tuesday, RSA. That's when we've decided as a company it's best for us, but we want the press to be clued in. Like, tell us under embargo a week ahead of time, so that way I know to be on the lookout for it, or else like I'm gonna miss it. I'm gonna be so honest, I'm going to miss it in my inbox that week. So
good to know. I think that all makes sense.
Yeah.
One question that's come in, we talked a little bit about events, after hours things. A lot of brands do kind of kitschy, guerrilla-y type stuff at events like this, of course, at RSA. Would love this panel's perspective on, does that work for you? Do you think there's value to the brand? Just general, take the ice cream trucks, the, banners flying over, whatever it might be.
I feel like everyone's afraid to go
Go
first,
ahead,
so
Sam. What do you
I'll
think?
bite the bullet.
Yeah.
I think they're fun. I do enjoy it as I'm running around desperately looking for any sort of food during the show. I will say I cannot recall. I remember these things happening, but I couldn't tell you which brands actually do it, which maybe it will signal to you all the value of them. They're fun, but if the idea is to get your name out there and I don't know, do some marketing, it's really such a fog at RSA. I cannot recall who did what food truck when. I can picture where they are on the corners near Moscone, but the names are escaping me. So, food for thought, perhaps.
Yeah. Food is certainly effective because what I know is not on any of our calendars is budgeting time to eat. So so it may or may not be long-term memorable, but it probably in the moment will create a halo effect, which is, maybe worth something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective is the more of an experience that you make it, the more interesting it is. And I mean, I happen to be a bourbon person, right? So I like more of a, unique bourbon tasting experience where you can have that experience with others. So it's not just networking and hanging around, but you're experiencing something together So I may say, oh yeah, Sam, I remember we were doing the bourbon tasting thing together at RSA. So the more experiences that you give people where they can enrich, their own experience, I think is really attractive. The other thing that I personally like is joint events. So if there's like 2 or 3 or 4 organizations that are doing an event together, I would probably more likely go to that as opposed to just one vendor, because I get to meet multiple organizations and understand what they're all doing. And that's a quote unquote better use of time, if you will. So I'm a big fan of joint events. We do a lot of joint events. Matter of fact, we're going to be doing one with AWS at RSA and a number of other partners. So that would be my advice, is look for opportunities to do joint events. And it helps from a cost perspective as well, if you could split it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love that. I think that's a good note to end on, kind of maximizing everyone's time. So thank you all for taking time to weigh in, to share your perspectives. We'll check in to make sure you're comfortable with us sharing contact information with attendees, but we will circulate the recording and that information. And thank you to all of our attendees. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.